you think the government has been transparent, but it strikes me that they're only transparent after you've asked questions in terms of what's set out in the financial memorandum. And indeed, I find that quite difficult to actually understand what the numbers are telling me. So first of all, I'd just like to ask you both, I mean, do you think there's actually, in terms of what is published, sufficient clarity in order for us to essentially commit to what potentially allows ministers to create quite significant financial liabilities for the government, especially given that you have asked the clarity. And then specifically, in terms of how to understand the numbers, and again, I thank Fraser of Allender for their summary tables because I find them easier to follow than the ones in the memorandum. But is it correct to say that there's the £527 million figure, that's a recurring cost for the additional resource and effort for running the system? And actually, if you look, would it also be correct to say that at the high end of the estimates, at the establishment phase, there's 300 million of non-recurring one-off costs? But the other key thing is, the assumption is that 8.9 billion of identified costs in social care will essentially just carry over in the new regime, and there won't be savings. Essentially, assuming that all that administrative cost that's in there essentially will need to continue, and this is all additional cost. Is that the right way? So, do we have enough transparency? Is the documentation enough to make that sort of decision? And is that the right way to interpret the numbers?
On the last question you asked, your explanation there is my understanding of the figures. So there's the additional setup costs are large, and that 500 or so million pounds, I believe, is a recurring top-end estimate once we're in the steady state after it's all been set up. But then there is the money carried across that currently goes through the local government settlement and from other sources in order to pay for social care. But that figure in itself, it could be very different by the time we get to that money being transferred over. On the transparency point, I do concede that the transparency was there once we asked the questions, and that what was originally published in the financial memorandum, for us at the Fraser of Allender, there wasn't enough information there for us to work through the figures and understand how they'd been put together. But our conversations with officials, once we found the right officials, was very constructive, and it was they were clearly very willing and able to explain them. Quite why that information wasn't all in the financial memorandum, I can't tell you, but it's not my understanding that they were trying to hide any of it. It was just to be in how it was put together.
Essentially, you're saying in order to understand these numbers and the financial implications of just what's involved with setting up the new organisation, you needed to, in your own words, find the right officials and ask them the right questions. Do you think all 129 MSPs in the Parliament will necessarily know to do that? Because essentially we're being asked to approve this on the basis of the documentation, not conversations with officials.
I mean, I don't disagree. I mean, the reason we did this work, and it was CCPS who gave us some funding to do it, was to provide that clarity that was missing, we felt, in the documentation. So we were trying to do the job for you, essentially. So because we saw that there were questions there were issues that weren't quite clear in how the figures are worked through. So we did that working through the numbers. But what you say is correct, and that we wouldn't have been able to do that if we hadn't been able to speak to the right officials to get the information. And I do think that is a problem.
Mark, would you agree with that, both in terms of my interpretation of numbers and also in what's Audit Scotland's thought around the transparency, and whether Audit Scotland are experts in looking at management information and whether decisions are being made in a robust and repeatable manner? Do you think the presentation of the information that we have would lend to that sort of itself to that sort of decision making?
Well, fundamentally, of course, you will be the judge of that. I think the things that I would say are, I think we're clear that there is limited detail about where the numbers come from in terms of there's narrative and then there's numbers, and how the narrative relates to the numbers is not as clear as it might be. And we haven't had the opportunity to speak with government officials to get into the detail of that in the same way as colleagues have, but I think that's apparent from reading it. I think the broader point is the one we made before, is there's also costs here that have been identified but not costed, and therefore the amount in aggregate or the range of the effect of those costs is unknown, and we're not able to add detail onto that. The third point I'd make, and goes back to your last original question to Emma, is one of the points we make in our submission, which is perhaps a bit more cryptic than it might be, so let me explain it, is the relationship between the figures in Table 2, which are the overall spend, or what could potentially transfer, and the costs here. And a big part of that was that question about, are there any efficiencies in here? Are there any efficiencies that are being assumed that this model will allow that activity to be generated more efficiently, either in terms of efficiencies within those cost numbers, or restricting the rises of those costs, probably more likely in the future. And again, that whether that's the case or not is not clear. The drive of the bill, of course, is for quality and consistency. There's a fundamental question is where does efficiency fit in that, and does that affect the overall numbers? And then that takes us on to a whole different discussion around preventative spending, models of care, reconstruction and the like. So I think that's the question that we had about that.